so you can connect it to a PS2. I think most PCs still come with a PS2 port if you wanted to use it. Laptops, because of space, seems to be happening a lot less now. HDMI to VGA. This convert is an active device that allows you to convert your digital HDMI signal to the analog VGA signal. Converter may also have a 3.5 inch audio port, so audio from the converter to a device. Just depends on what you need really. It's useful if you want to connect your laptop to an older projector or monitor. It's an active device because active processing is required, which is inside the housing there, to convert the high definition content for an analog display. Again, you can look up all the documentation if you're really interested in all the signals and stuff like that. The converter bus is powered from the HDMI port. It doesn't require a power source. Well, most of these adapters don't actually require a power source. So we've looked at the instruction: DVI to HDMI, USB A to B, USB to Ethernet, DVI to VGA, Thunderbolt, PS2, HDMI to VGA. That's all for now.
Feel the thorns embrace.
Motherboards, form factors. We've discussed a lot about the internal components of a motherboard and what makes it the spinal cord of a computer, but what we haven't talked about are the physical components of a motherboard, meaning sizes. And if we look at all of these different motherboards that I have on this screen, you see that they each have different physical components. For instance, this has a cutout on it. This one is much more compact, especially if you look at some of these internal sort of components. Here, this one looks much different from the others. And this looks more like a standard motherboard we're going to see on many computers. And that's because these each have different form factors, the physical limitations or the physical configurations of the motherboard. And so what I want to cover are some of the most popular form factors that you're going to find on the A+ exam and that are out there in general. And these are ATX, micro ATX, which is a derivative of ATX, ITX, and BTX. Finally, I want to just quickly discuss the main power connector you're going to see for an ATX motherboard, since it will come up on the exam. And we'll cover that again in more depth when we get to power supplies and power connectors. So first I want to take an overview of all these different motherboards, and we'll come back to this table. But what I've done here is just giving you a quick overview of the physical dimensions of each of these form factors here, and also some of the identifying characteristics, what makes these form factors stand out if you were just to look at them, and some of the things that they are used for. So let's start by looking at ATX and micro ATX. Now ATX stands for Advanced Technology Extended. And as I write that up there, the reason it has that extended on it is because AT used to be the main form factor for motherboards, and it was replaced by this one, the extended version, okay? And ATX is the most common form factor out there. One thing that makes it recognizable from other form factors is that the RAM slots, which are here, and the expansion slots, which we've talked about right here, and just as a review, this would be an AGP slot, and these right here look like PCIs. We also have our PATA, and I don't see any SATAs on this one, but I do see a battery for the CMOS, and here's where our CPU would go in. Here's some more PATAs right here. So, this ATX, this is the most common version by here. One thing you'll notice is between the micro and the standard, the depth is actually the same. These are both 9.6 inch between micro ATX slot. Everything else is these micro here and here. The next motherboards. And the interesting thing about ITX is not many people know can really identify what the I stands for. It was probably just a replacement for the A. It sounded cooler and thinner. But one thing that the ITX motherboards were designed for are some higher power motherboards that could work in smaller spaces. So the mini ITX, this one right here, is mostly designed for HT PCs. And if you don't know what that is, that's HT stands for home theater. So these were mostly for computers you're going to plug up to your TV. And the reason that these were designed is because not only are they smaller, but they actually keep a little quieter, and that's because they use passive cooling, which we'll talk about when we get into cooling. And passive cooling is using heat sinks and things like this that don't have fans. There's no active cooling going on, so they're a lot quieter. They also conserve a lot more power, which is important when we're talking about connecting it to your computer, to your television. We also have these nano ITX motherboards, and these are even smaller than the mini ITX motherboards. Mini ITX motherboards, by the way, these holes do line up with ATX motherboards, so they are backwards compatible with ATX. So that's just important to know, is you can put a mini ITX on a micro ATX or an ATX motherboard. The Nano 8 ITX also has a with ATX motherboards, so they are backwards compatible with ATX. So that's just important to know, is you can put a mini ITX on a micro ATX or an ATX motherboard. The Nano 8 ITX also has a low power consumption, but it's smaller because it's used for computers that many of you probably aren't going to build, but for more like set-top boxes like DVRs. And it's also used for video recorders, automotive PCs that you're going to find in a car. So they're much smaller, require a lot less power to a certain extent, but the needs of the motherboard are still met. Finally, you're going to see a Pico ITX. And Pico have very powerful processors, a lot of RAM. They actually require active cooling, so they do require fans and such because they're so small. And they're used in very, very small PCs, sometimes things that are called ultra-mobile PCs. So these are just important to sort of understand. The ITX was a replacement for ATX. It's seen in a lot of other non-standard computers that you're probably not going to build. If you're building a computer, you're probably looking at an ATX. You might be looking at an ITX over here. In this case, you can see that the RAM slot is perpendicular to the expansion slot, but there are a lot fewer of them, right? And that's because it's much smaller. One that's not mentioned on this is actually what's called a mobile ITX. You're probably not going to see that on the exam. I just want to mention it, and that's been more for sort of smartphones, mobile sort of healthcare devices, etc. It's just important to sort of point those out. And you can see how they can get smaller and smaller depending on the needs. Finally, we have BTX, which is balanced technology extended. So the only difference here is this letter right here. And these are for processors that require a lot more heat, release a lot more require a lot more power, release a lot more heat. And you can see that they're actually designed to kind of reconfigure the way things are. You see that here the expansion ports are all the way on one side, the RAM is on another side, and the CPU in this case is actually put at a certain angle. And this just allows it, these are really made for servers, high power servers that really require a lot more power and have a lot more heat going on. You're really going to see these in servers. You might be building a computer based on this form factor if you're building a server, but most of the time we're probably going to buy a server. Alright, so just going back to this table that we've created, the main difference you can see here between the ATX and the BTX are where the RAM slots are for that one. The micro ATX actually shares the same depth with the ATX. It's just a little wider. They are backwards compatible. These ITX do have several different, iterations, and they're designed for home theater PCs, smartphones, things that are smaller, require less noise. And the BTX, these are really for servers and high-power computers that are going to need a certain, different form factor for whatever reason. So now we've covered the major form factors, including ATX, the most common form factor, micro ATX, which is an iteration of the ATX. We looked at some different ITX form factors, which again are backwards compatible with both the ATX and the micro ATX. And then we looked at the BTX, which is for servers. So now I really quickly want to look at the power connector. So this is actually a pretty new power connector, and the reason I can tell you that is because it's really big. And usually when you used to see power connectors, they used to actually be divided about down the middle. And one was called a P9, and then one was called a P8. I don't necessarily know why they had that differentiation, but they were there. And now what they've been done is they've been sort of merged together, and it's now one big P1. I assume it has something to do with the way the ports were lined up and the way that they interacted. But if we look at a motherboard here, you can see here's the big connector right here, big power connector, and this is for an ATX form factor. This is the most common connector that we see. And if we look at...
Hey everybody, it's Tony Robbins. Listen, I'm driving the studio right now. I just want to make sure you don't miss out. We have once a year, we do this one...
a pin sort of diagram that differentiates all the 24 pins in the different colors. You don't need to memorize this whole thing, but you do need to notice that there are 3 voltages that stand out. 12 volts, 5 volts, and 3.3 volts. You might want to recognize that orange, generally speaking, is going to go along with 3.3 volts. Red, generally speaking, is going to go with 5. And yellow, generally speaking, is going to go with 12. You might get a question on the test that asks you one of those. It's important to recognize these voltages because these are the different voltages that come into the motherboard from the power supply, and we will cover these again when we go into power supply. But on the test, you might see one of these 3 pop up, and it's important to recognize which colors are associated with which one of these voltages. Just looking at this again, I want to show you where the power connector is on this motherboard, which is right here. This is where that big old P1 would plug in, and there's 24 pins in here, and if you see right here, there's a little keying, so that way you make sure you're plugging it in the right way. You can also see that they're sort of rounded. Here's a square sort of port, right? But some of these are somewhat round, and that's to make sure that you plug it in the right way. Obviously, if you plug your power in the wrong way, it's going to blow the system. All right, so we've just covered the power connector, that P1, or used to be a P8, P9 power connector, and we will cover that more in depth when we get to power supplies. So really quickly, we talked about the main form factors, including ATX, which is our most popular. This is it. This is the most popular form factor you're going to see. Micro ATX, which is backwards compatible with the ATX, but it's just smaller. That's the only difference here, is this one is a good deal smaller. Okay, we also looked at the ITX, which is also backwards compatible with these. BTX, which is mostly for servers. And then we looked at the power connector, and what we talked about was it used to be differentiated into a P8 or P9 power connector, but now it's usually just one big P1 power. So now that we've talked about the physical designation of these motherboards, the internal, I want to go into some software that's built onto the motherboard called the BIOS. And this is really important when we get into starting up the computer.
Has been slain. Wait until my seeds take root.
Motherboards. The BIOS. We've talked about motherboards from a hardware context, including the buses and chipsets that make them what they are, the form factors that make them fit into certain chassis and identify the physical characteristics. We've also talked about these expansion ports on the side for input-output ports, and also these expansion ports internally and storage technology. But now what I want to talk about is this thing called the BIOS, which is software that tells the computer what to do the minute power reaches the motherboard for the first time. So we're going to talk about this thing called the BIOS, and we're also going to talk about the CMOS, which holds the information for the BIOS, the actual chip, the CMOS battery, and we'll explain the difference there in a minute. Post, or the power on self-test, that tests the hardware components through the BIOS. Then we'll talk about upgrading or flashing the BIOS. And following that, we'll talk about configuring the BIOS, including the time and date configurations, boot device priority, which devices get priority when we're booting the computer up, how we can set a password in the BIOS, the power management features that need to be set in the BIOS for them to work in an operating system, virtualization and how that's supported by the BIOS, Wake on LAN, which is a specific feature that allows you to wake up a computer over the network, and then we'll talk about the BIOS and some monitoring that it does. And this is all specific to things you need to know for the A+ exam. It gets a lot more in-depth if we were actually to take an entire class, say, on the BIOS. So let's start with the BIOS in general. The BIOS stands for Basic Input-Output System, and it is the instinct of the computer. It's what makes the baby chicken peck through the egg. It tells the computer what to do the minute power reaches the system. It is the first thing that runs when you boot the PC, and it identifies, tests, and initializes system components. So then once you get into your operating system, the operating system can access these components. It basically acts as sort of a conduit between the software you're going to use and the hardware that's on the motherboard. Some of the hardware that it's going to test and initialize is the RAM, or the memory, the random access memory. That's our short-term memory, we call our RNAV. The storage, that's our long-term memory, which could include internal or external storage, such as USB drives or hard drives. Optical drives like CD and DVD drives. And then the CPU, the central processing unit, the processor, what we're going to talk about in the next video section.
Here's how Docker brings developers up to code. Docker keeps all your work inside a computer.
Wait until my seeds take root. Just a such a busy world. An ally has been slain. Killing spree. A summoner has disconnected. Your turret has been destroyed. The forest so much more.
picture of the BIOS if you were to go into it, and you see here some of the things that it is looking for. So it tells us the memory that's in the system. It also looks at the CPU type and speed. Here's the version of the BIOS in case we needed to upgrade it. Tells us if there's a hard drive, CD-ROM drive installed. This computer has a disk, floppy disk, so it tells us about that too. And finally, you can see here the date and time. So you can see all this information is in the BIOS. And right up here, I just want to point out this says Phoenix BIOS. That is the manufacturer of this BIOS. There are many, many different types of manufacturers. And although the specifics of how the BIOS is going to look changes from computer to computer, the basics are the same. Here's another version of the BIOS, another Phoenix version actually. And you can see here some boot order stuff that we will talk about later. So the BIOS is the software, it's that basic input-output system. The CMOS is the chip that holds the BIOS. It stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor. Complementary because it's complementary to the motherboard and to the BIOS. And it stores the contents of what the BIOS finds. So if the BIOS says, hey, I have 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 1.8 gigahertz processor, it's going to pass that information onto the CMOS to hold on to. So, for instance, you get the type and speed of the CPU, drive capacities, date and time are some of the things that it stores. And one thing that's important to notice is that it is volatile. And what this word means is that when the power is off, it loses its contents. So this is different from non-volatile memory, which will maintain the contents of the memory even when the power is on. So because this is volatile, all this information, every time the computer gets turned off, would disappear. But some of this information, like date and time, for instance, we want to maintain even when the computer is turned off. That's why we have to use a CMOS battery. It's a lithium-ion battery right here on the computer, and it looks like a watch battery. Now, I've zoomed in a lot so you can see this. But this battery is necessary for maintaining all this data that the BIOS finds and allowing it to stay on the CMOS even when we turn off the computer. We'll come back to the importance of this battery a little bit later.
Does your enterprise need the peace of mind that their team's Apple devices stay secure no matter where they are in the world? In the office, in the home, or anywhere in between? Kanji lets you rapidly deploy and manage enterprise-level security.
So the post is related to the BIOS in that it is the power-on self-test. So it is the testing function of the BIOS. It is the first step in the boot process of the BIOS. So when the BIOS initializes, the first thing it does is run this power-on self-test, which tests all of the components, and then it passes errors onto the BIOS and then onto the user. And it does this through either using code numbers or audio beeps. Now, I've capitalized audio beeps here because this is really important. Let's say that the display goes out, your monitor's not working because of some error that the post found. It now cannot notify you via a code number on the screen. Instead, it's going to give you audio beeps that you can then find a decoder for and figure out what the problem is. Now, one thing that's important to know about these audio beeps is that they differ from vendor to vendor. There's no sort of general speaking 3 beeps equals that or 2 short beeps equals that. This is sort of similar to like a Morse code, kind of, but there's no universal, right? So I use that as a metaphor to describe how it's going to talk. It has short beeps and long beeps, but it is not a Morse code in the same way that it's going to spell out something. All right, but again, the way the post notifies you is by a beep, and sometimes you might have heard that one big beep when you start your computer. That's just telling you everything's okay. If you heard multiple beeps and nothing showed on the screen, you'd know something was wrong, and you could go to your vendor manufacturer guide and you can check out what the beep means. So here's an example of a post chip on an old system, and you can see here there's an LED that'll tell you sort of a number that you could look up. There's also light codes and other stuff, and there's actually probably an audio sort of built into one of these. There's probably a little mini speaker that would beep for you. But nowadays, we don't have a separate chip for the post. It's all sort of built into the BIOS. And you can see here what it's actually doing is going through and double checking all the information it's finding. And then what would happen is you generally get then like a big old beep, and that would tell you everything's okay, and you'd be ready to go. And that's the power on self-test. So we just talked about the BIOS, the basic input-output system, the very first thing that runs when I boot up the computer. And what it does is it is stored on the CMOS chip. The CMOS chip is powered by a battery because it is, I'm going to write that word out again, volatile, which is an important word. The power on self-test, is that test that runs very first thing in the BIOS, and it sends information down to the BIOS, which then can send information to the user in case something is wrong. Now sometimes, just like any piece of software, the BIOS is going to go out of date, and then we would need to upgrade the BIOS. So flashing the BIOS is erasing and rewriting the BIOS firmware. Now firmware is the persistent memory and code stored in it, meaning that it's persistent, it doesn't change. So that's why when you buy a motherboard, it has this BIOS firmware built onto it. It's not software, it's not soft, right? It's not hardware because it's not software being sort of the software. It's soft, it doesn't really have a physical shape. Hardware being something that is hard, that's physical. Firmware is this sort of in-between. It's memory, that volatile memory.
Minions have spawned.
It's fun to walk around in different skins. Mayo Shoma feels strange.
persistent, and the code is always stored in it. So the firmware, rather, I should say, is non-volatile, right? Because every time I turn off the system, I still want the firmware to remain. I still want the first codes to tell the computer, search for something, right? It then passes that temporary information on it finds to the volatile memory of the CMOS. But the firmware it doesn't change, it's persistent. And as a result, we need to flash the new firmware onto the circuit. Meaning when I upgrade it, I'm not just installing or overwriting something. I'm literally erasing the instinct the computer has when it starts and replacing it with a brand new instinct. And so, if something happens while I'm flashing, and that word flash sort of has that idea that there is no moving parts, right? It's all electronic, which is why it has that flash, and you might recognize the word from, say, a flash drive, which also has no moving parts. But when you flash new data onto persistent memory, you're erasing the old instinct, replacing with the new one. If something happens during the process, then, like you lose power, then you've basically done what we call bricking the system. Meaning you've just turned your very expensive computer into a big old brick that is now no good for anything. Anyone who's been in the industry for a while has at some point lost power while flashing, and you have bricked a very expensive piece of equipment. So this basically renders your equipment unusable. So it's very important that you only flash the BIOS if absolutely necessary. For instance, if you have a new feature that you need on your motherboard that can only be enabled through the firmware software upgrade. So here's an example of a screen that while a firmware update is going on, while the flash is going on, and it asks you, do you want to update the adapter firmware? You say yes, then identifies it, erases the original firmware, and then updates the new one. So where you get this is the internet. You go on the internet and you search for the new firmware. You then download it onto a bootable device. Bootable device meaning that the computer can boot off of it. So what would happen is you turn on the computer runs that BIOS self-test, it then finds, say, a USB drive that is bootable. It recognizes the new software on there that's going to upgrade, and then it goes through this upgrade right here. Once you've upgraded it, you restart, and you're good to go.
With DataCamp, you don't need to download Python to learn Python. You can learn right in your browser with hands-on exercises for coding and data analysis, all in a way that makes data kind of fun. Go to datacamp.com and start learning for free today.
This is Dave, head of marketing at a ketchup company about to use Grammarly to handle a tight deadline.
Here's another version of the BIOS, a flash BIOS ROM utility. So ROM being...
Everything is falling down!
That non-volatile memory, that firmware that we're going to upgrade. It's another word for it. We'll talk about that when we get into memory. And this is just sort of designating where the firmware is going to go. And finally, here's another one, and you can see it. This is actually running off of a floppy disk. So this is an older firmware upgrade, and you can sort of see it upgrading with the blue and the white as we're going. So now we've talked about upgrading or flashing the BIOS, and that's, by the way, flashing a BIOS, it's not just going to happen on a motherboard, but on any device.
Riku, no one suspects. People can be everyone. How can people be squishy anyone? Very ethical. I swing by the river. Everyone knows it. I like you in a good way. Oh, Theo, you must be angry now. Spirits are
Courageous Giga Guard.
Device that has power going to it for the first time. So it's a printer. Your phone has BIOS on it because it is a mini computer. Routers have BIOS on them that you firmware on them that need to sort of run. So now let's talk about some of the configurations we set in the BIOS. So when we get start up the computer, you generally see something like this, which will tell you you can press a certain button. Sometimes it's delete or F2, and that'll enter the setup. And the setup is sort of the area where you can configure the BIOS. Now, one of the settings that you can set is the time and date. Now, generally, the first time we set this, we set it, and then we like it to sort of stay the way it is. But don't forget that we're using non-volatile, but don't forget we're using volatile memory, meaning that when the power goes off, so this is kept current by the battery. So one thing you'll see on the test, if the battery dies, the date and time will constantly reset, which makes sense, right? Because now there's no power to maintain that CMOS chip. So this is important. If the battery dies, the date and time will reset. So if you get a question asking you, why is the date and time constantly resetting? It's probably because the battery is dead. We also can set the boot device priority, and this tells the BIOS which device to boot from first. So for instance, we were just talking about flashing the BIOS, and we mentioned that you might want to boot off of a USB drive. Well, you tell the BIOS what devices to look for in what order. So for instance, here is an example of some boot device settings, and you can see right here, it's giving us an order for the boot device. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to look at the floppy drive. In this case, this computer has a floppy. Most computers don't nowadays, which is why they're no longer covered on the A+ exam. But it used to be you could boot off a floppy drive, and that's how you would get into specific Me2 diagnostics. If it didn't recognize a floppy disk, then you'd probably go over to a hard drive. Now in this case, look to see drives are
blending in. Is Nico near? No one knows. I am here.
Ally has been slain. Turret has been destroyed. Unstoppable.
Can our spirits be friends still? If Nico can be everyone, how can Nico be sure she's anyone? Where is Nico? I saw Nico by the river. Everyone knows Nico likes rivers. What to do? Deep breath? Ooh, have picnic! Just minding my own business, nothing, Nico. How can anybody miss? All around. Everything's normal. Nothing suspicious.
If light travels so fast.
No one expects Nico to not be Nico and to be not Nico instead. It's fun to walk around in different skins.
An enemy has been slain.
Galactic hyper barrier. Hyper flame spitter.
I will. I will.
been destroyed.
A master.
Nico was out, but never down.
Shut down. An enemy has been slain.
Not Nico. Nico back in her Nico skin. Every place is beautiful. Every place
Has
is
been slain.
danger. Is danger beautiful?
Audacious bravery shield.
If Nico can be everyone, how can Nico be everyone?
An enemy has been slain.
Magic! There are so many more. Why do people say blah 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 first and questions later? Nico needs answers now. Get Everyone invited to a picnic, isn't it? Who stands in Nico's way? Dummies with small showman, that's who.
RAM it's going to boot from. So if you're trying to boot off of a CD or DVD, for instance, let's say to upgrade Windows, and you put that CD drive in, or you put that CD in your CD drive and you boot up the computer, it's still going to go straight to your Windows because it's looking at the hard drive before the CD drive. So what you'd want to do is actually move this device up here to second. We can also set a password in the BIOS, which is something we want to be very careful about. This isn't like setting a password in your operating system. This is setting a password in the BIOS, the main software that makes the motherboard start. So if you forget your password, you're sort of in trouble. Unless, of course, your motherboard happens to have that CMOS battery on it, because that means that the CMOS is maintaining that password via the power in that battery. So one way to reset the password is to take out this battery and restart the computer. Another way you can do it is actually right here. This thing is called a jumper. Let me write that over here. And it's a jumper because that little blue thing has some metal in it. And you see this, there's one little metal stick right here. And what happens is the metal inside of this stick connects two of these pins together and it creates a circuit. So when I take this jumper off, it actually resets the circuit. And by doing that, I can also reset the password. So the two ways we can reset the password are either by the jumper or by replacing the battery.
Everybody, it's Tony Robbins. How you doing out there? Middle of the storm.
Now, we're going to talk more about power management later when we get into the operating system, but it's important to know that some of the power management features we'll talk about require BIOS support. So your computer can't just hibernate or sleep if the BIOS does not support it. So it's important to realize that if you want your computer won't hibernate, for instance, it might be because your BIOS needs to be flashed to the newest version, or your motherboard just doesn't support it in general. This is the same with virtualization. Now, virtualization must also be supported by the BIOS. Now, if you don't know what virtualization is, it's a word we're going to see pop up again and again on this A+ test because it is the new, it is sort of the new major thing that we're seeing in computers nowadays. And what it basically means is I have one hardware computer. I'm just going to draw a box here to represent that. And on it, I can have several virtual computers. So, for instance, I have one big computer, but I have 3 computers virtually on that. So let's say I have an XP computer, and maybe I have a Linux box, and then I have a Windows 7 computer. And all of these are not physical. These are virtual computers running on one big physical computer. And you can see my drawing skills are not so great, but just pretend that is a computer. All right? But again, this needs to be supported by the BIOS. Wake on LAN is a feature which allows the computer to be woken up through a network message. And LAN, this comes from local area network, which is something we will talk about when we get into networking more. But this is a feature that allows, through the network, you to wake up the computer, and this might be done in case of you have a server that you want to wake up remotely. And so this is just an important feature that is on the BIOS, and you need to enable it if you want to use it. The BIOS also monitors several different things, including temperature, which is important because we're going to deal with heat a lot, and the BIOS needs to know how hot the computer is getting so that it can turn itself off before damaging itself, just in case. It's also going to look at fan speed, again, related to temperature. If the fan speeds are going too fast or too slow, there's probably a problem, and so it needs to recognize that. There's also intrusion detection. Now, this is an important one. I've seen it pop up in the test time and time again. Intrusion detection is actually an old BIOS feature. I don't see it very much anymore, but it does not relate to viruses, and it doesn't relate to hacking. Okay, so this is not what that has to do with at all. What it has to do with actually is someone physically opening the computer, which is something that we were probably more worried about 15 years ago than we are now, and it's a holdover. So what would happen is if you had opened the computer or someone had opened the computer, the next time you booted up, the BIOS or the post would tell you intrusion detection. Someone has intruder detected, which basically just meant someone had opened the computer at some point. Finally, it's also going to monitor voltage, which again is related to the fan speeds and the temperature, and we'll talk more about voltage when we get into power supplies. It's also going to look at the clock, and this is not just the clock as far as time, but also speeds, and it's also looking at bus speed, which is the speed that the CPU, how fast the CPU can get, and we'll talk more about CPU bus speeds when we get into the next video section on CPUs or the processor. All right. So now we've talked about configuring the BIOS and all the different settings that has to do with. So I want to quickly just go over everything we talked about in this video, so we can leave you with sort of one last repetition, okay? We talked about the BIOS. This is the first thing that starts. This is sort of what I call the nature of the computer, right? If we're talking about nature versus nurture for a human being, nurture would be sort of what your parents teach you. Nature is what you're born with, and this is what the computer is born with. It is what it needs in order to start up. The CMOS is the chip that contains the BIOS. It is volatile. Let's write that word out here again because that's an important one, meaning that the memory will reset itself whenever power is gone, and therefore we need to have a battery to provide power so that certain information such as the date and time, the password don't get lost. We also talked about the post, the power on self-test, which is the first thing that runs when the BIOS starts up, and it is let's put that test, and it generally is going to notify you via beeps. Finally, we talked about flashing the BIOS, and flashing the BIOS, that's like updating it, except it's a much more root sort of way of updating the BIOS, and if something happens in the middle of flashing, you've just done what's called bricking your system, turned it into a large brick. We also talked about configuring the BIOS, and remember, usually there's a setting that says, like, you enter DEL, hit your delete button or F2 to enter setup. We talked about time and date, and how if your battery is going, right, if the battery begins to go, this is not going to stay up to date. We also talked about boot device priority, which is determining if you want to let your CD drive or your USB or your hard drive boot first. We talked about the password and how, again, you can reset that using the battery. You can also reset it using jumpers. Power management and virtualization. The important thing to know here is the must be set in the BIOS. They must be enabled in the BIOS for them to be enabled on the operating system. We also talked about wake on LAN, LAN being a network, and so this allows you to wake up the computer over the network remotely. And finally, we talked about the fact that the BIOS monitors certain things, such as the CPU speed, bus speed, and heat. All right, so now that we've talked about all of this stuff having to do with the BIOS and the motherboard, I want to go into the next component, the component that goes onto the motherboard, so we'll see a little overlap here. But specifically, I want to talk about the CPU, the central processing unit, the brain of the computer. CPU, technology and characteristics. Now that we've discussed the spinal cord of the computer, the motherboard or the system board, I want to talk about the brain of the computer, the CPU. And I want to begin by talking about the technology of a CPU and some of the characteristics that make up different CPUs you're going to see on the exam. So first we're going to talk about the technology of a CPU by giving you an overview of what the CPU is, talk about some of the brands that are out there, the clock rate and the clock speed, which are somewhat different. We're also going to talk about the difference between an external and an internal clock speed and how those affect the CPU, and how you can do what's called overclocking to make your CPU, your processor, run faster than it's actually built for. We're also going to talk about some of the characteristics of different CPUs, including the cache. That's not money as in money cache, but cache, size and type. We're also going to talk about a technology called, or rather a characteristic called hyper-threading, multi-core CPUs, the architecture of CPUs, whether they're 32 or 64-bit, which is something you might have seen on some software packages. And finally, we'll talk about virtualization and something called the integrated GPU, which is similar to CPUs, except it's specifically for graphics. So first, what is a CPU? Well, the CPU is the central processing unit. It's the brain of the computer, and as a result, it's the most expensive and the most important component. That's because it executes all the instructions that come from just about any other part of the computer. So it basically allows the computer to run. Without it, the computer cannot work because it cannot think. It must be compatible with the motherboard. Now, this is really important. You can't just go buy a CPU and then buy a motherboard and expect they'll work. There are a couple different things we have to check for. for. And we'll talk about what are called sockets later on, which is the physical connection of the CPU to the motherboard. But the chipset also needs to be compatible with the central processing unit, the CPU, its speed, etc., etc. So it's important that when you purchase a CPU, you make sure that you purchase a compatible motherboard, which would generally be listed someplace on the packaging. Now, there are several different brands of CPUs out there, and here you can see a picture of a couple different ones. The two biggest brands that you're going to see out of the market, this is the same with the chipsets, are AMD and Intel. Now again, you might see other companies building the internals of this, or sometimes the external. However, Intel and AMD are the two major brands out there, and they each make different flavors of and they each make different types of CPUs depending on the needs, not just speed, but also the internal. And what's really interesting, actually, is the CPU itself is actually really small. It's housed inside of this case, and it's probably about this big, if not smaller, and it's a piece of glass that has a whole bunch of circuits etched onto it that allow it to work at a certain speed. And it's actually a very complex thing, and gets to a whole other side of sort of technology and CPUs. But for our knowledge, for us in this, for the A+ exam, all you really have to know is Intel and AMD, and that they are the two manufacturers that make most of the CPUs you're going to be dealing with. So let's talk about clock rate. Now, when you go to purchase a CPU, it's going to be identified by something called a clock rate or clock speed. The clock rate identifies the frequency or the speed of the CPU and what it's capable of achieving. So this is measured in hertz, which is cycles per second. If you're sort of an electronics geek, this has to do with sort of sine waves. So I'm just trying to draw a wave here, right? We have sort of this axis, and you might have seen this. And basically, a hertz measures the amount of time that it takes to get from one point to the next point. And most CPUs today use gigahertz as they're measuring. And just to give you a qualification of what that is, that's about 10 to the 9th hertz, or 1 trillion hertz. So a gigahertz, if you think about that compared to megahertz or just plain old hertz, which we used to see in computers, it's quite a deal faster. And again, that has to do with how many of these cycles it can go through in a second from here to here. Don't have to know that for the A+ exam, but I just draw that out there so that you have an understanding of how that works. Now, clock speed is slightly different from clock rate, and there are actually two different types of clock speeds we're going to talk about. So while the clock rate measures the potential speed of the CPU, how much it is potentially able to go, the clock speed indicates its actual speed, how much it's running on the computer, how fast it's running. So this is just like a car that can run, for instance, 120 miles or kilometers per hour, but you rarely are going to drive that CPU to the maximum. And sometimes, if you tried really pushing it, you could probably push the CPU, or the car rather, to go faster than 120 miles per hour. So there are two types of clock speeds we're going to look at. The first is the external clock speed, and I have a picture of a motherboard here because the external clock speed is determined by the motherboard. In other words, if I plug a CPU that's really fast into a motherboard that's really slow, I'm limited by that motherboard. So the base clock of the motherboard is also known as the bus speed. So we talked about buses, and we talked about that is how data is sent from one place to another on a motherboard. It's like a circuit. And the bus speed determines how fast that can go. And this is also known as the external clock speed. So they're just two different names. If you see them, they're pretty much interchangeable. And this generally is the frequency of the FSB. And if you remember what the FSB is, that's the front side bus, which is the connection between the north bridge. If you recall the difference between a north bridge and a south bridge. So that's the connection between the north bridge and the CPU. So this right here, if we were to use this line as sort of that connection, this would be the bus speed. And what's interesting, the reason I chose this image right here is because if you look right here, you see some jumpers. And if you recall, we talked about jumpers previously. These jumpers, this is how we used to do it. You had to set physical jumpers on the motherboard to tell it how fast the CPU should run. So it couldn't just recognize it manually. You had to tell the motherboard this CPU is running at 686, 600 megahertz. And so we needed to set that in the motherboard, so the motherboard knew how fast to push the CPU. And we'll come back to this point in just a bit. There's also the internal clock speed, and that's the one that you see generally when they're packaging the CPU when you go out and buy one. This is the internal frequency or speed of the CPU. So for instance, if this was a 1.2 gigahertz processor, that would be the internal clock speed of the CPU. And then you would have to check to make sure the bus speed on the motherboard was equivalent or could handle that amount of speed. Now, there's something called overclocking, and remember I said that the motherboard sometimes has to be told how fast the CPU is going. So in this case, and what people will do is they'll tell, this is user-defined, and this is actually a little bit newer. So what's happening here is instead of setting the CPU operating speed via jumpers on the motherboard, it's setting it via this, probably a BIOS sort of interface. And what you could do is tell the motherboard that the CPU was actually faster than it was, and this would push the CPU to go faster than it was made to go. Now, the reason you might want to do this is if you're running really high-end graphics and you needed that extra oomph, but you didn't want to be limited, and you didn't want to be limited by the technology that was currently out. So you would tell the motherboard to overclock the CPU. It was very dangerous because it pushed the CPU past the limits it was supposed to go. However, it didn't keep a lot of people from doing it. And when we get to heating and cooling a little bit later, we'll talk about how people have managed to sort of combat the heat and the side effects of overclocking the system. But it's important to know that overclocking means telling the motherboard to run the CPU faster. All right, so we just talked about some of the technology, including what the CPU is, the central processing unit, the brain, the two brands of most processors, which are AMD and Intel. We talked about the clock rate, which is generally the potential speed of, which is the potential speed or frequency of the processor. And then we talked about the clock speeds, both the external and the internal speed. The external being the motherboard or the bus speed, the internal being the the processor's market speed. And then we talked about overclocking, which is telling the motherboard to move the CPU faster than it for what it was made. So now let's talk about some of the characteristics of different CPUs that we're going to see. The first one I want to talk about is cache size. So here's an image just to describe what I'm about to tell you. And basically, we have 3 different types of caches. And what cache is sort of a temporary holding space for data. If you imagine the CPU is running very fast, and the rest of the computer, either because the bus speed of the motherboard isn't quite as fast, or because the speed of the RAM, the memory, isn't as fast, it needs sort of a buffer zone. Just like when you're downloading Netflix movies or you're streaming them, it downloads a little bit more, so that way in case of a network flub, you don't see any sort of pausing. So we have different sorts of caches that allow for a buffer so the CPU can get information as quick as possible and then pop it back out as quick as possible. And if it's running faster or slower than the rest of the system, the cache allows you to make up for that. Now, there are 3 different types of caches, and you just generally need to know that the L1 cache is the fastest, and that's because it is built onto the CPU. So you see, here's the CPU core, right, which is inside that little glass thing I was talking about. And we have 2 different caches, L1 caches, that they're listing here. I is for instruction, and D is for data. But you don't need to know that for the A+ exam. Just know there's an L1 cache, and it is built onto the CPU. As a result, it is the fastest cache. However, it is also the...
Possession is 9/10 of the law, and those 3 Dawnite beaming totems are mine fair and square.
It's fun to walk around in different skins.
has been slain.
Where is Nico? I saw Nico by the river. Everyone knows Nico likes rivers.
An enemy has been slain. Double kill.
Neo Shoma feels strange. Yeah. I am definitely not Nico. No. I am normal. Everything's normal. Nothing suspicious. Is Nico far? Is Nico near?
God gets this!
Sharing memories, colors, feelings, magic. Magic connects people. Nico, no one suspects you are Nico.
A summoner has reconnected.
Movie cat vacation over. Back to work. If Nico becomes Nico,
An ally has been slain.
Nico will not waste her
smallest because we can't allow so much information to get access to the CPU, and it's also the most expensive. We then have the L2 cache, which used to be built onto the motherboard. Now it's usually built onto the CPU, but it's accessed after the L1 cache. So it comes after that L1 cache, and it's not as fast, but it is superior to the L3. It is faster, and it acts as a interim. So we go from L1 to L2, and then we can go from L2 to L3. So this is the second fastest. And then we have the L3, which is the largest capacity, but also the slowest, okay? And what it generally does, the L3 is generally the one that's going to talk to the RAM chips. That's the memory. And we'll talk more about that when we get into memory in our sort of next series of videos. The real important thing to know here, and I'm going to pull up another graphic here, is that you have the core of your processor, right? As we go down, we get more latency, meaning this is the slowest speed, and this is the fastest speed. Conversely, the capacity goes the opposite way. So the faster, the smaller amount of space we have. So just know the L1 cache is the closest to the core, then L2, which is generally also built onto the CPU, and then you have L3, which is generally built onto the motherboard, sometimes onto the CPU, depending on the make, but the L3 deals directly with the memory. Okay, so it's important to know that L3 and memory go together, and that L1 is built right onto the core, and although it's the fastest, it's also the smallest. And that's why we have several different versions of L1 through L3 cache. And when programmers write programs to use the CPU, they can write things to use these different caches in different ways in order to make their programs run the most efficiently. So hyper-threading allows a single CPU to accept and process two independent sets of instructions. So if you look at this word hyper-thread, imagine that the CPU had multiple threads in it. And what it could do is, even though there's one core here, so there's only one CPU core, there's only one processing unit in there, it could accept two sets of instructions in and out at the same time. So this allows it to sort of virtually simulate having two different CPU cores. Now, this is different from multi-core processors, which literally have two or more actually processing cores. And we see this more and more with dual-core and even quad-core processors, which inside the processor has multiple cores so that the CPU can process instructions from multiple sources at once, and this makes it act faster. And then if we added hyper-threading to this, that would then double the speed of 4, so then it would make it essentially able to process 8 sets of instructions at one point. So the hyper-threading is taken to the next level in this multi-core technology. That's just important to know there is a base here somewhat in that hyper-threading does it virtually, multi-core actually does it. You've also probably seen this 32-bit versus 64-bit architecture. What you need to realize about this is that 64-bit architecture allows the CPU to have a wider bit, have twice as many bits, right? And because it has twice as many bits, it can process higher data types. 32-bit architecture is limited to 4 gigabytes of data address space. And so you can imagine if I have a lot of data going on, let's say I have more than 4 gigabytes of RAM, which is memory, right? And I'm using 32-bit architecture, well,
Bone is a poor alternative.
Nico is best decision.
alternative.
Conquistador? That's your gamer tag? Conquistador?
Oh, she's sweet but a psycho, a little bit psycho, and like she's screaming, mama, mama, oh, she's hot but psycho, screaming, mama, mama.
Nico is best decision. This place tastes like many emotions. Excitement, anger, joy, and salty. Is salty a feeling?
Welcome to Summoner's Rift. Seconds until minions spawn. Minions have spawned.
If Nico becomes Nico, what does she look like? Nico. Nico does not want to be here when the others arrive. Those do not get close. Why did you not? After 5 hands, everyone bited to 50. Even
An enemy has been slain. Enemy killing spree.
Slow down? No! Fast, fast, fast! Is Nico far? Is Nico near? No one knows. If Nico can be everyone, how can Nico be sure she's anyone?
An enemy has been slain.
Nico back in her Nico face!
Ally has been slain.
I am definitely not Nico. No, not Nico. After 5, can Nico tell very exciting. Everything is going down! If Nico knows you're Shoma, Nico knows you. Battle time! Woo, woo! her own tribe now. People with no tails. Are they lonely? Yes. I am being me and doing me things. Not me. I have seen babies fight better than you.
Double kill.
Isn't that vacation over? Back to work. No more room for problems, please. Only room for more big brands.
An enemy has been slain.
Let's go! Scary circles all around.
Has been slain.
Words are tricky. Better to speak with colors and emotion. No one's Mayo Shoma feels strange. do now? Find cheese breads? Ooh, have picnic!
An enemy has been slain.
Everyone fears Nico now! Ha ha ha! Something different for a change.
An ally has been slain. An ally has been slain. An enemy
Oh, Teo, we must be angry now.
Your turret has been destroyed.
Dancing
Your
Nico.
turret has been destroyed.
Long show, that's all.
An enemy is legendary. Your turret has been destroyed. Defeat.
I can't use anything more than this 4 gigabytes. And now with computers with 8 gigabytes, I want to be able to take advantage of that. And a 32-bit architecture CPU is just not, it doesn't have enough space, it's not wide enough to allow that amount of processing. 64 bits allows for so much, I think it's over 1 million gigabytes. I think it's petabytes. A couple petabytes is sort of how much data address space, which is, it's theoretical. We haven't reached that yet, and who knows, I'm sure at some point we will. But that's like, a petabyte is, I think, 1 million gigabytes. So you can imagine how much more space the 64-bit wide CPUs allow. And the software must support 64-bit as well, which is why you probably see 64-bit versions of operating systems and 64-bit versions of software, which can take advantage of this CPU architecture. It's also referred to in some contexts as x86 or x64. Now, the 64 makes sense, right, because of this 64-bit. x86, that goes back to older CPUs, and I don't know if you remember, there were 286 processors and 386 processors, and then there were 486 processors.